The day my grandfather's will was read, I learned exactly what my family thought of me. Nothing. Not almost nothing. Not less than the others. Just nothing. The lawyer sat at the end of the long oak table with a thick folder in front of him. Around him were the people who had shared my last name my entire life, yet somehow felt more like strangers than family. My cousin Daniel leaned back comfortably in his chair wearing a watch that probably cost more than my car. Olivia sat beside him scrolling through luxury apartment listings in Manhattan like she already knew what she would inherit. And my Uncle Robert sat at the head of the table with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the entire future of the family already belonged to him. 3 weeks earlier my grandfather had died. And he hadn't died poor. He had died extremely wealthy. Real estate across several states. A shipping company with contracts along the East Coast. Investments quietly growing for decades. Nobody knew the exact number, but inside the family the estimate floated somewhere around $220 million. Everyone sitting at that table expected to walk out richer. Everyone except me. I had always been the quiet one in the family. Not the favorite. Not the ambitious heir. Just the one who existed somewhere on the edges. But there was one person who had always treated me differently. My grandfather. When I was 16, I spent entire summers with him repairing old fishing boats behind the lake house. While everyone else was partying or posting photos on expensive yachts, we were sanding wood, replacing bolts, and fixing engines that smelled like rust and oil. Sometimes he would stop working, look at the lake, and say things I didn't understand at the time. Most people inherit money. Very few inherit responsibility. Back then I thought he was just being philosophical. Now I realized he meant something else entirely. The lawyer finally began reading the will. My grandson Daniel receives the lake house property in Michigan. Daniel smiled immediately. My granddaughter Olivia receives the Manhattan apartment. Olivia squeezed her husband's hand and whispered something excitedly. My son Robert receives controlling interest in the family shipping company. Robert slowly leaned back in his chair and nodded like a man who had just received confirmation of something he had always believed was his. Then the lawyer paused. And finally, he turned to the last page. My grandson Michael receives. The room became quiet. Every pair of eyes turned toward me. For a moment I felt something unexpected. Hope. Not because I expected millions, but because my grandfather and I had shared something the rest of them never understood. Then the lawyer finished the sentence. My sewing machine. For 2 seconds nobody reacted. Then Daniel started laughing. Olivia joined him. Robert covered his mouth but couldn't hide his smile. A sewing machine. From a man worth over $200 million. The lawyer slid a photograph across the table. An old Singer sewing machine sitting in the corner of my grandfather's dusty workshop. Robert shook his head. Dad always had a strange sense of humor. Daniel leaned toward me. Maybe you'll start a clothing brand. The laughter grew louder. But something inside me didn't feel insulted. It felt wrong. Because my grandfather had never done anything without a reason. He was many things, strict, quiet, sometimes even cold. But careless was never one of them. And humiliating someone for entertainment definitely wasn't his style. As everyone stood up and began discussing property transfers and tax strategies, the lawyer quietly walked over to me. He handed me a small envelope. Your grandfather asked me to give this to you personally. Inside was a note. 6 words. Look where we fixed the engine. My heart skipped. 10 years earlier my grandfather and I had spent 3 days repairing an old fishing boat behind the lake house. The engine had been completely destroyed. Rust everywhere. Oil everywhere. We had taken half the boat apart to reach it. At one point he had tapped the inside of the hull and said something strange. Sometimes the most valuable things are hidden when nobody wants to look. At the time I thought he meant tools. Or spare parts. The next morning I drove 6 hours to the lake house. Technically Daniel owned it now. But he hadn't arrived yet. The fishing boat was still behind the workshop exactly where we had left it years ago. Dust covered the hull. The engine compartment creaked when I opened it. At first, everything looked the same. Then I noticed something. A thin metal weld line running across the inner hull. Fresh. Too clean to be 10 years old. My hands began shaking. Because welding metal like that inside a hull only happens for one reason. To hide something. 10 minutes later the metal plate broke loose under the pressure of a crowbar. Behind it was a small waterproof steel container. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside there wasn't money. There weren't jewels. There was a flash drive. And another envelope. Inside the envelope was a second note from my grandfather. 4 words. 4 words that changed everything. They are stealing the company. For several seconds I just stood there beside the boat staring at the note in my hand. They are stealing the company. My grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp. Clean. Controlled. The same way he had signed contracts worth millions without the slightest tremor in his hand. But this note felt different. Urgent. Almost desperate. I looked down at the flash drive again. It was completely plain. No label. No company logo. No handwritten mark. Just a cheap black flash drive that looked like it could have been bought at any gas station for $5. And somehow that made it even more terrifying. People hide expensive things in expensive containers. They hide dangerous things in ordinary ones. I closed the steel box, shoved everything into my backpack, and got out of there as fast as I could. For the first time since the will reading I had the feeling that this wasn't just a puzzle my grandfather had left behind. This was a trap. Or maybe a weapon. And I still didn't know which one. The nearest motel was 20 minutes away on the old highway outside town. It was the same fated place my grandfather used to joke about whenever we drove past it. Only 3 kinds of people stay there, he once told me. Cheaters, drunks, and men in trouble. By the time I parked outside the neon sign, I had a feeling I qualified as the third. I checked in under my own name without even thinking about it. That was my first mistake. The woman at the front desk barely looked up. She slid the key across the counter, chewing gum like she had seen every kind of disaster come through those doors and stopped caring long ago. The room smelled faintly like old carpet and cheap cleaning spray. I locked the door, pulled the curtains shut, and sat down at the tiny desk by the window. For a long moment I just stared at the flash drive in my hand. Then I plugged it into my laptop. A single folder appeared on the screen. Insurance. My stomach tightened. Inside were dozens of files. Spreadsheets. Contracts. Emails. Audio recordings. Scanned documents. Bank transfers. At first it looked like chaos. Random business paperwork. The kind of dull corporate material nobody would ever willingly read unless they were being paid to do it. Then I opened the first spreadsheet. Numbers. Rows of wire transfers. Amounts in the hundreds of thousands. Then millions. Each payment had been routed through consulting firms I had never heard of. The names sounded fake in that polished corporate way fake things often do. Northbridge Advisory. Holloway Maritime Strategies. Carver International Holdings. I opened another file. Then another. The same pattern appeared over and over. Large transfers leaving the company. Passing through shell firms. Landing in offshore accounts. And every trail ended in one place. Robert Hale. My uncle. The same man who had just inherited control of the entire company 3 hours earlier. I felt my pulse start pounding in my neck. I kept opening files. The earliest one was dated 6 years ago. The latest had been created only 3 months before my grandfather died. For 6 years Robert had been draining money out of the company piece by piece, quietly enough that nobody on the outside noticed. Or at least nobody except one person. My grandfather. I opened a folder marked Correspondence. Inside were emails. Hundreds of them. Most were boring. Logistics. Legal cover. Routing approvals. Discussions written in the careful bland language of men who believed they were too smart to ever get caught. Then I found one that made my jaw tighten. It was from Robert to an executive named Paul Mercer. The message read, "Once the old man is gone, everything becomes clean. No one will question the transfers after the board is aligned." I read it 3 times. The old man? That was how Robert referred to his own father. Not dad. Not father. The old man? Like he was talking about an obstacle. A delay? A problem waiting to die. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my hand over my face. My grandfather had built that company from nothing. Literally nothing. He started with 1 cargo truck and a warehouse lease so small it had no office, only a folding table and a phone bolted to the wall. By the time I was born, he had built a regional shipping empire. By the time he died, the company controlled contracts across half the East Coast. And now his own son had been quietly bleeding it dry. I opened one of the audio files. The recording began with the sound of glasses clinking and silverware against plates. A restaurant. Probably private. The voices were low but clear enough. Then I heard Robert. Relaxed. Confident. The voice of a man who thought he had already won. "Once the will is finalized, I control the board. After that, nobody can touch us." Another voice asked, "What about Michael?" There was a pause. Then Robert laughed. Not nervous laughter. Not polite laughter. Real laughter. "Michael? He's harmless." Several men at the table laughed with him. Another voice said, "Still, your father trusted him. More than the others." Robert answered immediately, "That's exactly why he gets nothing." A few more laughs. Then he said the sentence that made my blood turn cold. "My father always thought Mike could see through people. If he ever saw the numbers, he'd start asking questions." The recording ended. I stared at the screen in silence. Suddenly the sewing machine made sense. The note made sense. The boat made sense. My grandfather hadn't left me nothing. He had left me evidence. And not just evidence. He had left me a mission. I opened the final file in the folder. A video. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 4 days before he died. My grandfather sat behind the desk in his office. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner. More tired. But his eyes were still the same, sharp, cold, alive. He looked directly at the camera. "Michael, if you're watching this, it means I was right." He paused for a moment. "Robert has been stealing from the company." I swallowed hard. Hearing the words from him made everything feel heavier. More real. "I gathered enough proof to destroy him," he continued. "But if I expose him myself, the company collapses. Investors panic. Contracts fail. Employees lose jobs." He leaned forward. "So I made another plan." For the first time since the video began, something changed in his expression. Not warmth exactly. Something harder. More deliberate. "Robert believes he has already won." He glanced down, then back into the camera. "But in 3 days the board meets to finalize control of the company." My hands tightened on the desk. "If you bring this evidence to that meeting, Robert loses everything." He paused. Then he said something that made my entire body go cold. "And Michael, if you do this correctly, you will inherit the empire he tried to steal." The screen went black. For several seconds I didn't move. 3 days. That was all the time I had. 3 days to walk into a room full of executives, lawyers, and men who had probably spent years protecting Robert. 3 days to accuse the most powerful person in my family of fraud on a scale I could barely understand. 3 days to either destroy him or get destroyed myself. Then I heard footsteps outside my motel door. Slow. Measured. And stopping right in front of it. Every muscle in my body locked. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and for 1 second the room felt too small to breathe in. I reached over and snapped the laptop shut without thinking. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then came a knock. 3 slow taps. Not loud. Not angry. Just confident. The kind of knock made by someone who wasn't asking permission. I didn't answer. For several seconds there was silence. Then a man's voice came through the door. Room service. I looked at the small metal chain on the door and almost laughed. This motel didn't have room service. I stayed quiet. A second later the voice spoke again, this time lower. You should leave town, Michael. Then the footsteps moved away. I waited nearly 2 minutes before I opened the curtain a fraction of an inch and looked outside. A black sedan was pulling out of the parking lot. No plates on the front. Tinted windows. By the time I got outside it was already gone. That was the moment the whole thing changed for me. Up until then I had still been treating it like a secret. Something hidden. Something dangerous, yes, but still confined to files and recordings and my grandfather's plans. Now it was real. Someone knew where I was. Someone knew I had found the drive. And someone wanted me scared enough to disappear. I didn't sleep that night. I copied every file from the flash drive onto 2 separate hard drives, then uploaded encrypted versions to a cloud account I hadn't used in years. At 4 in the morning I sat on the edge of the motel bed staring at the wall while the sun began to lighten the edges of the curtains. At 7 I checked out. This time I paid cash. The city felt colder than usual when I got back. The headquarters of Hale Shipping stood in the middle of downtown like a monument to everything my grandfather had built. 40 floors of glass and steel. His name still engraved above the main entrance in letters tall enough to be read from across the street. Inside that building, Robert was already acting like king. Maybe he had been acting that way for years. I went to a cafe across the street and took a booth near the window. From there I could watch the entrance while going through the files again. That was when I found another spreadsheet. Board alignment. The title sounded harmless. The contents were not. There were 12 names on the list. The 12 members of the board. Next to each name was a number. 5 million. 3 million. 7.5. 2 million and a condominium transfer. I stared at the screen. They weren't numbers. They were bribes. Robert hadn't just stolen from the company. He had already bought the people who were supposed to protect it. Which meant one thing. Walking into that boardroom with evidence might not be enough. They might bury it. Or deny it. Or worse, turn it back on me. I was still looking at the spreadsheet when someone sat down across from me. I looked up. And felt the air leave my lungs. Robert. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, sunglasses in one hand. He looked rested. Calm. Almost amused. Like a man meeting his nephew for coffee rather than cornering him after a felony. Michael, he said. Long time. I didn't say anything. He set his sunglasses on the table and glanced at my closed laptop. You've been busy. Still nothing from me. He smiled faintly. You went to the lake house. My stomach tightened. He folded his hands. You opened the boat. The smile remained. And you took something that belongs to me. I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck. So he knew. Or at least he knew enough. What do you want? I asked. He looked almost pleased I had spoken. To help you, he said. I nearly laughed. Help me? He nodded. Believe it or not, yes. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and slid an envelope across the table toward me. I didn't touch it. What is it? Open it. Inside was a bank document. A statement from a private account. The balance was listed clearly. $10 million. $10 million. I looked up at him. He didn't blink. Take the money, he said quietly. For a second I thought I had heard him wrong. Walk away. He leaned back and crossed one leg over the other like this was the most reasonable conversation in the world. No board meeting. No accusations. No family scandal. You disappear, the problem disappears, and everyone gets to keep living comfortably. I stared at him. $10 million. More money than most people see in several lifetimes. Enough to vanish. Enough to change everything. And he knew exactly that. He was counting on it. You think I'm for sale? I asked. Robert's expression didn't change. I think everyone is for sale. The only difference is price. I slid the statement back across the table. Then you don't know me. For the first time, the smile on his face weakened. He studied me for a long moment, then gave a small sigh as if I had disappointed him in some minor but expected way. Your grandfather always did have terrible taste in loyalty, he said. Then he leaned closer. His voice dropped low enough that nobody around us could hear. You think you understand what you found? I held his gaze. But you don't. Something in his eyes had changed now. Less amusement. More warning. There are things in this company you know nothing about, Michael. Men attached to it you don't want to meet. Deals you don't want to interrupt. I said nothing. He leaned even closer. If you continue this, things become unpleasant. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and picked up his sunglasses. Then he paused. One final sentence. Ask yourself why your grandfather didn't expose me himself. And just like that he walked away. I sat there motionless long after he left. Because that question had been in my head since the moment I saw the files. Why didn't my grandfather do it himself? He had the evidence. He had the authority. He had the company, the board, the lawyers. So why leave it to me? By the time I got home that night, I had the answer. Because he knew Robert would move faster if he suspected a living enemy. But a dead man could set a trap that stayed shut until the right moment. I opened the flash drive again and searched every folder a second time, slower now, more carefully. That was when I found a hidden file buried inside an archived folder. Its title was only 4 words. If Robert contacts you. My chest tightened as I opened it. Inside was a short note written by my grandfather. Robert will try to buy you first. If that fails, he will try to frighten you. If that fails, he will try to remove you. I read the lines twice. Then a third time. There was one final sentence beneath them. There is a second flash drive. I sat back slowly. A second drive. The note continued. It is not with the evidence. It is with the person you trust the least. I stared at those words for a long time. Then one name came to mind immediately. Daniel. My cousin. The first person who laughed when I received the sewing machine. The same Daniel who now owned the lake house. If my grandfather had hidden part of the plan with him, then the game was even bigger than I thought. And suddenly the $10 million bribe didn't matter anymore. Because whatever was on that second drive, Robert was more afraid of it than he was of me. I drove to the lake house the next morning before sunrise. The roads were still wet from an overnight storm, and the sky over the lake looked like dull metal. On the highway I kept replaying my grandfather's note in my mind. The person you trust the least. It was almost too easy. In our family, Daniel had always been the performance version of success. Expensive car, perfect smile, good schools paid for by other people, and that effortless cruelty some men mistake for confidence. If you handed Daniel a wounded animal, he'd take a photo with it before asking whether it was worth anything. By the time I pulled into the gravel drive, music was already thumping from inside the house. It was barely 9 in the morning. That tracked. Daniel opened the door wearing sunglasses indoors and a black t-shirt that looked like it had never seen a washing machine because it was probably replaced after every use. He frowned for half a second when he saw me, then grinned. Mike, he said. Come for sewing lessons? I ignored the joke and stepped inside. The place already looked different. Not legally different. Emotionally different. It had taken Daniel less than 2 days to turn our grandfather's lake house into a prop for his ego. Empty bottles on the kitchen counter. 2 women I didn't know asleep on the back patio under blankets. Furniture moved for no reason except to make the place feel like it belonged to someone else. I need to ask you something, I said. Daniel shut the door behind me. That sounds dramatic. Did grandfather give you anything before he died? His expression shifted, just slightly. What kind of question is that? A simple one. He laughed, but there was tension in it now. No. He was lying. Daniel had always been a bad liar. He smiled too quickly and blinked just a little too much, like his face was trying to run 3 different stories at once. I stepped closer. He left you something, I said. And he told you not to give it to me unless I asked? For the first time the grin disappeared completely. He looked at me for several seconds. Then he said, "So you found the first part." I felt my chest tighten. "You knew?" He shrugged. "Not what it was. Just that I was supposed to keep something sealed unless you came asking." "Where is it?" Daniel turned and walked toward the kitchen. I followed him past the counter, through the mudroom, and into the old pantry at the back of the house. He reached above the top shelf and pulled down a plain white envelope coated with dust. He handed it to me. "That's it. That's what he gave me." I opened it immediately. Inside was a second flash drive. And a folded note. 3 words. "Trust no one." I looked up at Daniel. "Did you open it?" He shook his head. "Not worth the risk. You don't even know what's on it." He smiled without humor. "I knew it had something to do with Robert. That was enough for me." I studied him carefully. "Why didn't you tell him?" Now Daniel actually laughed. "Because I'm not stupid." He leaned against the pantry doorframe and crossed his arms. "Look, Mike. Whatever this is, I want no part of it. Robert scares me, Grandfather scared me, and frankly you're starting to scare me a little too." I slid the second drive into my pocket. "Then stay out of the way." I started to leave, but his voice stopped me. "He came here last night." I turned back. "Who?" "Robert." The kitchen seemed colder all at once. Daniel shrugged, but this time the act didn't fully hold. "He asked whether Grandfather had left me anything unusual. He was trying to sound casual, but he looked off." "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That Grandfather left me a house and a headache. And he told me if he showed up asking questions, I should call him." My jaw tightened. "Did you?" Daniel hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Half an hour ago." For 1 second all I could do was stare at him. "You called him?" He lifted both hands. "Relax. I didn't tell him what was in the envelope. I just said you came by." "Why?" "Because I'd rather have both of you mad at me than either of you thinking I picked a side." I should have hit him. Instead I turned and walked straight out of the house. By the time I reached my car my phone was vibrating. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. Robert's voice came through immediately. "I told you things would get unpleasant." Then the line went dead. I got in the car and drove away fast enough to spray gravel across the drive. 2 turns later I checked the mirror. A black SUV pulled out from the tree line and followed. For the next 20 minutes it stayed with me through every curve of the road, never getting too close, never falling too far behind. Close enough to be seen. Far enough to deny. A message. I took the next exit toward town, cut through a gas station, then turned down an older county road that ran along the backside of the lake. The SUV stayed with me. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. Last chance? No number. No signature. I looked at the second flash drive sitting on the passenger seat. Whatever was on it, Robert was afraid enough to send people after me in daylight. I kept driving until I reached the old marina where my grandfather used to keep spare parts. The building had been abandoned for years, but I still had a key to the side office because Grandfather never threw anything away, especially access. I parked behind the structure where I couldn't be seen from the road and waited. 30 seconds later the SUV rolled past the marina entrance, slowed, then kept going. They hadn't seen me turn in. Not yet. Inside the office I locked the door, pulled the blinds shut, and inserted the second flash drive into my laptop. This one had only 2 files. 1 video. 1 folder labeled Federal. I opened the video first. My grandfather looked even more tired than he had in the first recording. But his voice was steady. "If you are watching this, Robert knows you have the first drive." I swallowed. "He will try to recover it. He will fail." He paused, then added, "The second drive is not for the board." I looked at the folder name again. Federal. This drive contains evidence that cannot be buried by directors, lawyers, or private settlements. If Robert has gone as far as I believe he has, then the crimes no longer belong only to the company. He leaned closer. They belong to the government. The next sentence made my hands go cold. There is an active federal contact file in the folder. Use it only after you are certain the board has been compromised. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of offshore transfers, tax filings, shell ownership records, and internal communications tied not just to fraud but to money laundering and bribery across state lines. This wasn't corporate theft anymore. This was prison. Real prison. Years of it. Maybe decades. At the bottom of the folder was a document titled Read Last. I clicked it open. Michael, if you needed this second drive, then I was right about more than Robert. I was right about the whole room. And if the whole room is corrupt, you must not walk into it alone. At the very bottom was one name. Special Agent Elena Voss. And beneath it, a direct number. I stared at the screen while the wind rattled the side of the old marina office. Then I heard something outside. Not one vehicle this time. Two. Doors opening. Men's voices. And one of them said clearly enough to freeze my blood, "He's in here." The first thing I did was mute my phone. The second was kill the laptop screen. Outside the office I could hear footsteps on old wood, slow and deliberate, testing the weak boards of the marina walkway. Whoever was out there wasn't panicking. That meant they thought they had time. Which meant they thought I didn't. I looked around the office fast. One door. One small window facing the lake, painted shut years ago. A desk. Metal shelves. A rusted sink. The same room where my grandfather used to sit for hours repairing reels and sorting invoices when he wanted to be alone. Back then I thought he came here because it was quiet. Now I understood something else. It was defensible. Someone tried the handle. Locked. Then a voice from outside. "Michael, don't make this worse." Not Robert. One of his men. I stayed silent. The footsteps shifted. 2 men at least. Maybe 3. I slid the laptop into my backpack, grabbed the second flash drive, and crouched beside the desk. My eyes landed on the old floor hatch near the sink, half hidden by a stained rug. I had forgotten about it. When I was a kid, my grandfather once showed it to me and said it led to the crawl passage used decades earlier for electrical work under the dock. Narrow. Dirty. Useless for anything except getting out of somewhere quietly. At the time I thought it was one of those old man stories that existed only to make boring buildings seem mysterious. Now it might save my life. The handle rattled again, harder this time. "Open the door." I pulled the rug aside, lifted the hatch, and a breath of moldy cold air rose up from below. There was barely enough room for a man to crawl through. Perfect. Would splinter near the top of the door. They were kicking it now. I slid into the passage feet first, pulled the hatch down above me, and began crawling through darkness thick with dust and damp wood. My backpack scraped overhead beams. Every movement sounded too loud. Then behind me came the crack of the door finally breaking open. Voices. "He's not here! Search!" I kept crawling. 10 feet. 20. 30. My shoulders were beginning to burn when I saw a faint seam of light ahead. I pushed upward and found another hatch under the far end of the dock platform. It lifted just enough for me to squeeze out between stacks of rotted rope and old fuel cans. From there I could hear the men inside the office, swearing now. One of them slammed something heavy against the wall. I moved low behind the marina structure, kept the lake to my right, and reached my car without being seen. Only once I was back on the highway did my hands start shaking. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city. Then I parked in the underground garage of a grocery store, opened the laptop again, and stared at the number at the bottom of my grandfather's file. Special Agent Elena Voss. I had no idea whether she was still active, still in the same office, or even still alive. But my grandfather had never written down a number without checking it twice. I dialed. The line rang once. Twice. Then a woman answered. Voss. Her voice was flat and professional. I looked around the car even though nobody could hear me. My name is Michael Hale. Silence. Then, go on. My grandfather was Arthur Hale. A longer silence this time. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. Where did you get this number? From him. He left me something. What exactly? Evidence. Another pause. Then she said, Are you alone? Yes. Do not go home. My grip tightened on the phone. Why? Because if Arthur Hale gave you my number, then he believed two things were true. First, his son was committing crimes. Second, the internal structure around him was compromised. I looked in the rearview mirror. No cars moving nearby. No black SUV. Not yet. She continued. If he was right, then you are now the weakest point in a very expensive problem. I swallowed. What do I do? Can you meet? Yes. 2 hours. Federal Plaza parking level C, south elevator. Come alone, bring both drives, and do not tell anyone where you are going. The call ended. For the next 2 hours I drove in loops through downtown traffic, changing routes every few minutes, checking mirrors, parking once just to see if anyone stayed with me. Nobody obvious did. That worried me more than if they had. Federal Plaza was a concrete block of a building that looked designed to discourage both hope and conversation. Level C was mostly empty. A woman in a dark coat stood near the south elevator with a paper cup in one hand. Mid-40s maybe. Sharp eyes. No wasted movement. Michael Hale? She asked. I nodded. She took the cup lid off and dropped it into a trash can without looking. Show me the first drive. No greeting. No smile. I handed it over. Then the second. She slipped both into separate evidence pouches from her bag with mechanical efficiency. Come with me. We didn't go upstairs. Instead, she led me to an unmarked conference room in a neighboring federal annex connected by a service corridor. Inside were 2 men already waiting with laptops open. For the next 90 minutes they went through the files while Agent Voss questioned me about everything. My grandfather, the will, the boat, Robert's offer, the motel, the men at the marina, Daniel's phone call. She never interrupted for sympathy. Only facts. When I finished, she sat back and exchanged a look with one of the analysts. Well? She asked him. He turned the screen slightly toward her. It's real. That was all. But it was enough. Voss looked at me. Your grandfather was careful. I know. He was also right. I said nothing. She folded her hands on the table. The board is compromised. At least partially. Probably more than partially. I thought about the spreadsheet. Board alignment. How bad is it? Bad enough that if we move too early, lawyers bury half of it, and the rest vanishes in injunctions before we can get warrants signed on every connected entity. I stared at her. So what are you saying? I'm saying your grandfather understood leverage. She stood and walked to the window in the conference room door, checking the hallway before continuing. If Robert believes he still controls the room, he'll be overconfident. If he's overconfident, he'll reveal who protects him. I understood before she finished. The board meeting. She nodded once. We need the board meeting. My mouth went dry. You want me to go? I want him comfortable, she said. Comfortable men make arrogant choices in public. That's your plan? That was your grandfather's plan. I'm just confirming it was a good one. One of the analysts closed his laptop. We can position outside the room, but not in it. Not until probable cause strengthens in real time. I looked from one face to the other. So I walk in there carrying enough evidence to ruin him, and you wait outside? Voss met my eyes without flinching. Yes. For a moment I almost laughed from the sheer insanity of it. Instead I asked the only question that mattered. And if he tries to stop me before I speak? This time she answered immediately. Then he helps us more than he helps himself. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Everything in me wanted to walk away. $10 million. A new life. No boardroom. No agents. No men kicking down doors at marinas. But then I remembered Robert's voice on the recording. Michael? He's harmless. And beneath that, another memory. My grandfather at the lake, grease on his hands, telling me that responsibility was the only inheritance that mattered. When I looked back at Agent Voss, the decision was already made. When do we do it? She checked her watch. Tomorrow. 9 a.m. She slid a business card across the table. On the back she had written only 2 words. Do not fail. As I stood to leave, she stopped me. One more thing. I turned. From now until tomorrow, trust no one in your family. Not even the ones who look frightened. Fear changes loyalties faster than money. I thought about Daniel. About the call he made to Robert. About the black SUV. About the men at the marina. Then I asked, what if Robert already knows I've contacted you? Voss's expression didn't move. Then tonight will be difficult. I left the building through a side exit, and halfway across the parking structure my phone lit up with a new text from an unknown number. You chose the wrong side. A second text arrived before I reached my car. Tomorrow, you won't make it into that room. I barely slept. Every sound outside my apartment pulled me awake. Elevators. Doors closing in the hall. Car engines on the street below. Twice I got up and looked through the blinds expecting to see the black SUV again. I didn't. That didn't comfort me. It just meant Robert had changed tactics or gotten smarter about being seen. By 6:30 I was already dressed. Dark suit. Plain tie. The same watch I wore to job interviews and funerals, the only 2 occasions in life where pretending to be calm matters more than actually feeling it. Agent Voss had told me to arrive alone, but not early. Early invites questions. Late looks weak. On time suggests control. At 8:52 I stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor of Hale's Shipping. The receptionist looked up, startled. Mr. Hale. Not Michael. Not even Sir. Mr. Hale. Funny how quickly titles shift when money starts changing direction. The board is already assembled, she said. I know. As I walked toward the conference room, I could feel eyes on me from behind glass offices and open doorways. People knew something was off. Maybe not the details, but the temperature in the building had changed. Fear spreads faster in corporate spaces than truth ever does. The conference room doors were open. 12 executives sat around the long table. Robert at the head. Exactly where he expected to be. He looked composed, but not relaxed. There was something tighter in his shoulders than the last time I saw him. His eyes tracked every movement I made as I entered. Several board members looked surprised. A few looked annoyed. 1 or 2 looked openly uneasy. Good. I closed the door behind me. Robert smiled first. Michael, he said. I didn't realize this meeting concerned you. I set my laptop on the table. It does now. A few of the directors exchanged glances. Paul Mercer, the same executive from the email, adjusted his cufflinks and avoided looking at me. Robert folded his hands. This is a closed governance session. I'm aware. Then perhaps you should leave before you embarrass yourself. The room was silent enough to hear the ventilation system overhead. I looked at each face one by one before answering. No. That word landed harder than I expected. Robert's smile thinned. Be careful. I opened the laptop, connected the first drive, and turned the screen toward the room. I think all of you need to hear something before this meeting continues. Robert stood halfway from his chair. This is not authorized. Then the audio began. His voice filled the room. Once the will is finalized, I control the board. After that, nobody can touch us. Nobody moved. The next line played. Michael? He's harmless. A few heads turned toward Robert. Then the next line. My father trusted him too much. If Mike ever saw the numbers, he'd start asking questions. When the recording ended, no one spoke for 3 full seconds. Then one director whispered, "Jesus Christ." Mercer looked like he might faint. Robert slowly sat back down. And then, to my surprise, he started laughing. Actually laughing. Not because anything was funny. Because men like Robert laugh when they believe fear still belongs to everyone else. "You think this changes anything?" he asked, looking around the room. "Most of this board works for me." No one answered. That was answer enough. He stood. "Michael has clearly been manipulated by grief and by documents he does not understand." I opened the spreadsheet labeled Board Alignment and pushed copies of the printouts across the table. "Do these numbers help?" Now the room changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But visibly. Eyes lowering. Breathing shifting. One woman on the board put both hands flat against the table as if steadying herself. Robert's face lost color for the first time. Then anger replaced it. He pointed at the door. "Security." The door opened almost immediately. 2 guards stepped inside. I felt the exact moment half the room assumed I was finished. Robert smiled at me with exhausted contempt. "You should have taken the money." The nearest guard moved toward me. Then another voice came from the hallway. "Hold." Everything stopped. The guards turned first. Then the board. Then Robert. Agent Elena Voss entered the room with 3 federal agents behind her. No rush. No shouting. Just the calm movement of people who no longer need permission. The lead guard stepped back instantly. Voss held up her badge. "Federal investigation. Nobody leaves this room." Robert stared at her. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely unsure. He recovered quickly. "This is a private corporate meeting." Voss nodded once. "And now it's an evidentiary environment." One of the agents moved to the far door. Another began collecting phones from the table. Robert looked at me. Then at Voss. Then back at me again. Understanding arrived in his face all at once. "The second drive," he said quietly. I didn't answer. His jaw tightened. "You stupid little bastard." Voss set a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed offshore transfers, tax records, shell company registrations, internal communications, and signed directives tied to Robert and 3 of the directors in the room. "This investigation now includes wire fraud, tax fraud, money laundering, bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction exposure pending execution of associated warrants," she said. No one in the room moved. One director actually closed his eyes like a man praying to a god he hadn't believed in for 20 years. Robert looked around the table, searching for loyalty. What he found instead was survival. People who had smiled for him yesterday suddenly looked interested in distancing themselves from oxygen if it might help. Mercer spoke first. "I want counsel." Then another director. "I never authorized criminal activity." Voss didn't even look at them. "Save it for your statements." Robert turned toward me one last time. All the arrogance was gone now. What remained was something smaller and uglier. Hatred stripped of confidence. "My father chose you?" he asked. "You?" I met his gaze. "No," I said. "He judged you." Something in him broke at that. He lunged, not far, not successfully, but enough for the nearest agent to pin him against the table before he got a full step. The room erupted. Chairs scraping. Voices rising. Orders shouted. Handcuffs. In the middle of it all I just stood there, strangely calm. Because in that moment I finally understood what my grandfather had meant all those years ago. Most people inherit money. Very few inherit responsibility. He never wanted me to have the sewing machine. Or the files. Or even the company. He wanted me to be the one man in the room who would not look away. 10 minutes later Robert was led out in cuffs past the glass offices of the company he had tried to steal. Employees froze at their desks. Assistants stepped into hallways. Phones were raised, then lowered when agents glared. The king was being carried out like inventory. When it was over, Agent Voss approached me near the window at the end of the conference room. Below us, the city moved as if nothing had changed. "You did well," she said. "It doesn't feel like winning." "It rarely does." I looked back at the ruined boardroom. "What happens now?" "Now the company survives if it deserves to. And the guilty discover how expensive arrogance can be." She started to leave, then paused. "Your grandfather requested one more thing, in the event this went as planned." My chest tightened. "What?" She handed me a sealed envelope from her folder. On the front, in my grandfather's handwriting, were 3 words. "For after justice." I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a single page. "Michael, if you are reading this, then Robert is finished and the company is still standing. Good. You were never my first choice because you were family. You were my first choice because you were the only one I believed would hate betrayal more than you loved comfort. Do not become like the men you exposed. If the board offers you the chair, accept it only if you are willing to protect the people who built this company, not the parasites who fed on it. That is your inheritance. Not money. Not buildings. Not power. Responsibility." I read the note twice before folding it carefully. When I looked up, Voss was gone. Outside the conference room, executives were already whispering about emergency votes, interim control, legal stabilization, investor messaging, reputation management. The machine was trying to save itself. But for the first time in years, maybe decades, it no longer belonged to liars. Robert had spent 6 years believing he was taking an empire from a dying old man and a harmless nephew. He was wrong on both counts. And somewhere in the middle of the chaos, with the sirens faint in the distance and my grandfather's note still warm in my hand, I realized something else. At the will, everyone else had inherited assets. I had inherited the truth. And in the end, that was worth more than all $220 million.